The historical portrait of William McKinley is a lie. They paint him as a mild, indifferent president, a seat holder for Theodore Roosevelt, a quiet interlude in the American story. What is the truth? Behind that placid exterior is a soldier who fought in the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. And behind the closed doors of the White House is a personal tragedy and a love story of almost unimaginable devotion. This is a story about tearing away that false portrait to reveal the real man, one whose quiet demeanor concealed the resilience of a battlefield survivor and the weight of a private, profound grief. His story begins in the small town of Niles, Ohio, where he was born in 1843. His was an ordinary middle-class American upbringing, steeped in the devout Methodist faith of his mother and the quiet ambition of his father, an iron manufacturer. Young William was a serious, amiable, and well-liked boy, known for his skill in debate and his deep sense of right and wrong. He was a freshman in college when the Confederate cannons fired on Fort Sumter in 1861, plunging the nation into civil war. Like thousands of other young men in the North, the 18-year-old McKinley was swept up in the patriotic fervor. He enlisted as a private in the 23rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry. His commanding officer was a thoughtful, bearded lawyer named Rutherford B. Hayes, a man who would one day become president himself and who would become McKinley's lifelong friend and mentor. McKinley was not a natural soldier in the heroic sense. He was not a daring cavalryman or a brilliant tactician, but he was steady, brave, and incredibly competent. He was soon promoted to the rank of commissary sergeant, a job that was essentially a quartermaster, responsible for supplying the troops with food and ammunition. It was a difficult, unglamorous, but vital role, and it was in this role, at the Battle of Antietam in September 1862, that the quiet young sergeant first showed the world his extraordinary character. Antietam was the bloodiest single day in American history. The fighting was a savage, unrelenting slaughter. McKinley's regiment was in the thick of it, pinned down for hours, exhausted and starving. From his position in the rear, McKinley could have simply waited for a lull in the fighting, but that wasn't his way. On his own initiative, he gathered up supplies, loaded 2 wagons with barrels of hot coffee and cooked meat, and personally drove the mule teams through the chaos of shot and shell to the front lines. He was a non-combatant, but he risked his life to bring comfort to his comrades. It was an act of such simple, profound courage that he became a hero in his regiment overnight. This was the pattern of his military career. He was always where the fighting was thickest, always displaying a calm bravery that inspired the men around him. He rose steadily through the ranks, from private to sergeant, from lieutenant to captain, and finally, by the end of the war, he was breveted a major. He had seen the horrors of war up close, had seen men die in staggering numbers, and the experience left an indelible mark on him. It gave him a deep and abiding hatred of conflict, but also a profound understanding of duty, sacrifice, and the sacred importance of the Union he had fought to preserve. After the war, he returned to Ohio, studied law, and began a promising career as a lawyer and politician. It was then that he met the love of his life, Ida Saxton. She was the beautiful, vivacious, and intelligent daughter of the wealthiest man in Canton, Ohio. She was cultured and charming, the belle of the town, and she fell completely in love with the quiet, handsome war veteran. Their courtship was a whirlwind romance, and they were married in 1871. They were the golden couple of Canton, their future seemingly limitless and bright, and then their perfect world fell apart. The story of William and Ida McKinley is one of the most heartbreaking love stories in the history of the American presidency. In 1871, their first daughter, Catherine, was born. But soon after, Ida's mother, to whom she was incredibly close, died. The grief, combined with the physical strain of childbirth, shattered Ida's delicate health. She began to suffer from severe headaches and fainting spells, the first signs of what was later diagnosed as epilepsy, a poorly understood and deeply stigmatized condition at the time. Then came the final crushing blow. In 1873, their second daughter, a baby girl they named Ida, was born weak and sickly and died just a few months later. That same year, their first daughter, little Katie, not yet 4 years old, died of typhoid fever. This succession of devastating losses, her mother and both of her children, completely broke Ida's spirit and her body. The vibrant, laughing young woman he had married was gone. In her place was a chronic invalid, a frail and fragile woman who would spend the rest of her life in a darkened room, suffering from crippling depression and frequent, unpredictable epileptic seizures. At this point, any other ambitious young politician might have seen his invalid wife as a liability, a burden to be quietly managed or even hidden away. But William McKinley was not any other politician. His response to his wife's tragedy reveals the foundation of his character, a profound sense of duty matched by an equally profound capacity for love. From that day forward, he dedicated his life to her care. He refused to let her be institutionalized or hidden. Instead, he built his entire life, both personal and political, around her needs. He would sit with her for hours, reading to her and holding her hand. He developed an almost telepathic sensitivity to her condition, often sensing when a seizure was about to occur. As he rose in politics, becoming a congressman from Ohio, he never wavered in his devotion. It was a common sight in Washington for Congressman McKinley to excuse himself from a political dinner, walk home to put his wife to bed, and then return to the gathering. He insisted on having her with him at public events, a radical act at a time when chronic illness was hidden in shame. There is a famous and deeply moving story about his time as governor of Ohio. At a grand state dinner, as his wife sat beside him, she suffered a seizure. Without a moment's hesitation, without a word, McKinley gently took the white handkerchief from his pocket and draped it over her face, shielding her contorted features from the curious eyes of the guests. He held her hand, continued his conversation with the person on his other side, as if nothing were happening, and when the seizure had passed, he quietly removed the handkerchief, and she rejoined the conversation. There was no shame, no embarrassment, only a simple, profound act of love and protection. This silent, protective gesture said more about his character than any speech ever could. While he was living this intense private life of caregiving, his public career was flourishing. In Congress, he became the nation's foremost expert and leading champion of the protective tariff, a tax on imported goods designed to protect American industries from foreign competition. To him, the tariff was not just an economic policy, it was a moral one. It was the key to American prosperity, protecting the jobs and wages of American workers. His powerful advocacy for what became known as the McKinley Tariff of 1890 made him a national figure in the Republican Party. By the end of the 1880s, William McKinley had established the two pillars upon which his life would be built. In public, he was the calm, dignified, and deeply knowledgeable champion of American industry. In private, he was the endlessly patient and devoted husband to a tragically broken wife. The boy who had learned courage under fire at Antietam had become a man who practiced a different, quieter, but no less profound kind of courage every single day of his life. He was a man defined by duty, both to his country and to the woman he loved. and it was these qualities that would carry him to the threshold of the presidency. As the 1890s began, William McKinley was a man on the rise. His long career in Congress, defined by his mastery of the protective tariff, had made him a national symbol of Republican prosperity. In 1891, he was elected governor of Ohio, a powerful industrial state and a crucial political bellwether. For 2 successful terms, he governed as a moderate and a unifier, skillfully handling a series of contentious labor strikes and further burnishing his reputation as a calm, steady hand in a turbulent age. He was widely seen as a leading contender for the presidency, but just as he was reaching the cusp of national power, a private crisis erupted that threatened to destroy everything he had built. It was a crisis not of politics, but of honor, and it would reveal both the core of his character and the powerful forces that were gathering around him. Years earlier, as an act of friendship, McKinley had co-signed a series of business loans for a close friend in Youngstown. It was a common practice, a gentleman's agreement. But in 1893, a massive financial panic rocked the nation, plunging it into one of the worst depressions in its history. McKinley's friend's business, like thousands of others, was wiped out. The friend went bankrupt, and suddenly Governor William McKinley was legally on the hook for a staggering debt of over $130,000, a fortune equivalent to millions of dollars today. The man who was the national champion of business and sound money was now facing personal bankruptcy and public humiliation. For McKinley, a man of profound personal integrity, the thought of not repaying every cent of his debt was unthinkable. He and his frail wife, Ida, prepared to give up everything they owned, their home, their savings, their entire future. His political career seemed to be over. It was in this moment of desperation that a pivotal figure entered McKinley's life, Marcus "Mark" Hanna. Hanna was a gruff, brilliant, and immensely wealthy Cleveland industrialist who had become McKinley's biggest admirer and political sponsor. Hanna was not an idealist. He was a pragmatist who believed that the business of government was business, and he believed that William McKinley was the one man who could lead the country to prosperity. He was not about to let his chosen candidate be ruined by a matter of personal debt. Hanna moved with breathtaking speed. He assembled a syndicate of the wealthiest and most powerful men in America, men like the oil tycoon H. Rogers and the steel magnate Andrew Carnegie. They formed a trust, took control of McKinley's assets, and quietly raised all the money needed to pay off the entire debt. McKinley was saved from ruin. It was a remarkable testament to the loyalty he inspired, but it was also a transaction that forged an unbreakable bond between McKinley and the great industrial and financial powers of the Gilded Age. He had been rescued by the very titans of industry his political opponents saw as the enemies of the common man. With his honor and finances restored, the path to the presidency was clear, and the election of 1896 would become a contest between 2 competing visions for America's future. The nation was still deep in the grips of the economic depression. Farmers were being crushed by debt, factories were closed, and a mood of angry, desperate populism was sweeping the rural West and South. This anger found its voice in one of the most electrifying figures in American history, the Democratic nominee, William Jennings Bryan. He was a young, charismatic former congressman from Nebraska, a fiery orator who saw the world as a battle between the virtuous farmers and the corrupt, moneyed interests of the East. At the Democratic convention, he delivered a speech that became an instant legend, the Cross of Gold speech. "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns," he thundered, his arms outstretched in a messianic pose. "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." He was calling for a radical change to the nation's monetary policy, the free coinage of silver, to create inflation and relieve the burden on debtors. To the establishment, he was a dangerous revolutionary. To millions of struggling Americans, he was a savior. Against this populist fervor, the Republicans nominated William McKinley. The stage was set for a battle for America's soul. Bryan, the passionate crusader, against McKinley, the calm voice of prosperity. And their campaigns were a study in contrasts. Bryan launched a revolutionary modern campaign. He crisscrossed the country by train, traveling an astonishing 18,000 miles and delivering over 600 speeches, sometimes dozens in a single day. He spoke directly to the people, his powerful voice ringing out in dusty town squares and packed auditoriums. McKinley, advised by the brilliant Mark Hanna, did the exact opposite. He stayed at home. In one of the most unique and ingenious strategies in political history, he conducted a front porch campaign. While Bryan went to the people, Hanna brought the people to McKinley. Using the power of the railroads, Hanna orchestrated a steady daily pilgrimage of organized delegations to McKinley's modest home in Canton, Ohio. There were delegations of factory workers, of farmers, of businessmen, of veterans. And from the calm of his own front porch, McKinley would deliver carefully crafted, reassuring speeches. He didn't shout or rage like Bryan. He spoke calmly about the full dinner pail, the importance of the gold standard for a stable economy, and the promise of a return to prosperity under his steady leadership. He was the very picture of safety and stability in a time of fear and uncertainty. Meanwhile, Mark Hanna, the master organizer, was inventing the modern political machine. He raised an unprecedented amount of money, estimated at over $3.5 million, more than 10 times what Bryan had. He created a political factory in Chicago that churned out hundreds of millions of pamphlets, posters, and buttons, printed in over a dozen languages to appeal to immigrant communities. He dispatched an army of 1,400 speakers to spread the Republican message across the country. It was the most disciplined, well-funded, and thoroughly modern campaign the nation had ever seen. On Election Day, the nation delivered its verdict. It was a decisive victory for William McKinley. He won the populous industrial states of the Northeast and Midwest, while Bryan swept the agrarian South and West. The election was more than just a victory for one man. It was a national realignment. It marked the triumph of an urban industrial vision of America over the old rural Jeffersonian ideal. The nation had chosen the factory over the farm, the gold standard over free silver, and the calm reassurance of the front porch over the fiery passion of the crusade. In March of 1897, William McKinley took the oath of office as the 25th President of the United States. With him in the White House was his beloved, frail Ida, her quiet presence a constant reminder of the private man behind the public office. He had a clear mandate from the American people to end the long depression, to protect American industry, and to restore order and prosperity to a fractured nation. His focus, and the nation's, was entirely inward. But 90 miles off the coast of Florida, a brutal rebellion was raging on the Spanish-controlled island of Cuba. The cries of the Cuban people for freedom were growing louder, amplified by the sensationalist headlines of a new yellow press in America. The man of peace, the architect of domestic prosperity, the devoted husband who craved a quiet and orderly world, was about to be confronted by a crisis that would test his character, challenge his deepest convictions, and drag him and his reluctant nation onto the world stage. When William McKinley entered the White House in March of 1897, he had a single overriding mission: to heal the American economy. He saw himself as the advance agent of prosperity, and he moved with a quiet, methodical purpose to fulfill his campaign promise of a full dinner pail. His first major act was to call a special session of Congress to pass the Dingley Tariff, a bill that raised taxes on foreign goods to the highest levels yet, protecting American factories and workers from foreign competition. And it seemed to work. Coinciding with the end of a worldwide depression and new gold discoveries, confidence surged back into the American economy. Factories reopened. Unemployment began to fall. The nation, weary from years of economic strife, breathed a collective sigh of relief. President McKinley was succeeding. His focus was entirely domestic. He was a man of peace and prosperity, a product of the 19th century who wanted nothing more than to cultivate America's own garden. But 90 miles off the coast of Florida, a rebellion was raging, one that would ultimately define his presidency and set America on a new course. For years, the island of Cuba had been fighting a brutal, bloody war for independence from its colonial master, Spain. The Spanish response was savage. The new Spanish governor, General Valeriano Weyler, instituted a horrific policy of reconcentration. He ordered hundreds of thousands of Cuban civilians to be herded into fortified camps, turning the countryside into a free fire zone. The conditions in these camps were abominable, with little food, no sanitation, and rampant disease. An estimated 200,000 Cubans, mostly women and children, died. This humanitarian catastrophe became the perfect catalyst for a new and powerful force in American life: the Yellow Press. In New York City, a titanic circulation war was being waged between two newspaper magnates, William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer's New York World. They discovered that stories of Spanish atrocities, often exaggerated or completely fabricated, sold newspapers by the millions. Their papers were filled with sensational headlines, lurid illustrations of Spanish soldiers strip-searching innocent Cuban women, and heartbreaking stories of starving children. General Weyler was dubbed the Butcher in headlines across the country, and a wave of public outrage and sympathy for the Cuban rebels began to build, putting immense pressure on President McKinley to do something. But McKinley resisted. This was the one area where his quiet nature concealed a core of absolute unbending iron. The man who had seen the dead piled up like cordwood at Antietam had a deep, personal, and visceral hatred of war. "I have been through one war," he told a friend, his voice filled with emotion. "I've seen the dead piled up, and I do not want to see another." He had no desire to lead the nation into another conflict, especially for what he saw as a foreign entanglement. He put his faith in diplomacy, patiently negotiating with the Spanish government, urging them to grant Cuba some form of autonomy and to end the brutal reconcentration policy. For a time, it seemed his patient approach might work. Spain recalled the Butcher Weyler and offered some limited reforms, but the jingoistic war fever fanned by the press was becoming a political inferno. His own party, led by dynamic young hawks like his Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt, was openly mocking his caution, calling him weak and spineless. Then, in early 1898, two events occurred that pushed the nation over the brink. First, Hearst's journal published a stolen private letter written by the Spanish ambassador in Washington, Enrique Dupuy de Lome. In the letter, de Lome described President McKinley as weak and a bitter for the admiration of the crowd. The insult to the nation's honor was immense. Then just 6 days later, on the night of February 15th, 1898, a catastrophic explosion ripped through the American battleship, the USS Maine, which was anchored in Havana Harbor on a supposedly friendly visit. The ship sank almost instantly, killing 266 American sailors and officers. While the true cause of the explosion is now believed to have been an accidental internal fire in a coal bunker next to an ammunition magazine, the yellow press immediately and definitively blamed a Spanish mine or torpedo. The public outcry was deafening. Across the country, the cry became a national slogan, a demand for vengeance. Remember the Maine. To hell with Spain. McKinley was now in an impossible position. He personally believed the explosion was an accident, but the political pressure for war was overwhelming. He spent weeks in a state of personal torment, sleeping little, his face etched with worry. He paced the halls of the White House at night, trying to find a peaceful way out. But in the end, the wave of public opinion was too powerful to resist. Reluctantly, sorrowfully, he concluded that war was the only way to end the bloodshed in Cuba and restore stability to the region. In April 1898, he asked Congress for a declaration of war. The Civil War veteran was, against all his instincts, about to become a war president. The Spanish-American War was, as one diplomat later called it, a splendid little war. It lasted just 10 weeks and was a stunningly decisive American victory. The first great blow was struck not in Cuba, but half a world away. On May 1st, a modern American naval squadron commanded by Commodore George Dewey sailed into Manila Bay in the Spanish-controlled Philippine Islands and completely annihilated the antiquated Spanish fleet anchored there without losing a single American life. It was a shocking victory that electrified the nation and suddenly thrust the obscure Philippines into the center of American consciousness. The land war in Cuba was a more difficult affair, but it too ended in a swift American victory, famous for the charge up San Juan Hill by the Rough Riders, a volunteer cavalry regiment led by the irrepressible Theodore Roosevelt, who became the single greatest hero of the war. Spain was soundly defeated, and now William McKinley faced a question he had never intended to ask, a dilemma that would change the course of his presidency and the destiny of his nation. What should the United States do with the spoils of victory? While Cuba was granted a form of conditional independence, Spain had also ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the entire Philippine archipelago to the United States. Suddenly, America was in possession of a colonial empire. The nation was immediately torn by a fierce debate over its own identity. On one side were the imperialists, men like Roosevelt and Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, who argued that it was America's destiny to take its place among the great world powers, to seek new markets, and to shoulder the white man's burden of governing lesser peoples. On the other side were the anti-imperialists, a diverse group that included figures like Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, and William Jennings Bryan. They argued that acquiring a colonial empire, ruling over other people without their consent, was a profound betrayal of America's own founding principles of liberty and self-government as laid out in the Declaration of Independence. The decision rested on the shoulders of one man, the quiet, devout Methodist in the White House. The fate of millions of Filipinos was in his hands. Years later, he described the agonizing process of his decision to a group of visiting Methodist ministers, and the story reveals the very essence of his worldview. He spoke of walking the floors of the White House night after night, of kneeling in prayer, seeking guidance. Returning the islands to Spain, he reasoned, would be cowardly and dishonorable. Turning them over to America's commercial rivals, France or Germany, would be bad business. and leaving the Filipinos to govern themselves was, he believed, impossible, as they were unfit for self-government and would soon fall into anarchy. And so, he concluded, there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace do the very best we could by them, as our fellow men for whom Christ also died. It was a decision born not of greed or malice, but of a deep-seated paternalistic sense of religious and national duty. In that moment of prayerful agony, William McKinley set the United States on a new and irreversible course. The isolated republic had become a global empire, but this new role came at a terrible price. The Filipino people, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, had been fighting for their own independence from Spain for years. They had initially welcomed the Americans as liberators. When they realized the Americans were there to become their new colonial masters, they felt profoundly betrayed. In February 1899, a full-scale insurrection broke out. The splendid little war against Spain was quickly followed by the long, brutal, and ugly Philippine-American War. It was a savage guerrilla war, fought in jungles and swamps that would last for 3 years. It would cost the lives of over 4,000 American soldiers and an estimated 200,000 Filipino civilians. It was a war marked by brutal tactics and atrocities on both sides, a dark and bitter chapter that stood in stark contrast to the easy glory of the war against Spain. As the century came to a close, William McKinley was the popular leader of a prosperous and newly powerful nation. He had won a war, acquired an empire, and seemed to have the full backing of the American people. He was now preparing for his re-election campaign in 1900 with the dynamic war hero Theodore Roosevelt as his new running mate. But the bloody, unfinished war in the Philippines was a festering wound, a constant reminder of the complex and often tragic consequences of his reluctant imperial decisions. The man of the 19th century had led America into the 20th, a new and dangerous era of global power that he and the nation were only just beginning to understand. As the 20th century dawned, America was a nation reborn, and William McKinley was the celebrated architect of its new reality. The deep economic scars of the 1890s had healed, replaced by the vibrant hum of industry and the tangible promise of the full dinner pail, a slogan that was now a reality for millions. The quick, decisive victory in the Spanish-American War had transformed the United States from an isolated republic into a global power with possessions stretching from the Caribbean to the Philippines. President McKinley, the steady hand from Ohio, had guided the nation through turmoil and into an era of unprecedented prosperity and international prestige. He was at the absolute apex of his popularity. The presidential election of 1900 was set to be a national referendum on this new America. It was a rematch against his old rival, the populist orator William Jennings Bryan. But the battleground had shifted. While Bryan tried to make American imperialism the central issue, arguing that ruling a foreign empire was a betrayal of the nation's soul, McKinley and the Republican Party focused on the undeniable prosperity at home. The choice they offered the American people was simple: a return to the economic uncertainty of the past, or 4 more years of the full dinner pail. The most fateful decision of that campaign, however, had little to do with McKinley himself. It concerned the choice of his running mate. The powerful and cunning Republican boss of New York, Senator Thomas Platt, had a problem. That problem was his state's governor, a man of boundless energy, maddening independence, and a dangerously reformist agenda. His name was Theodore Roosevelt. Desperate to remove this political cowboy from New York, Platt devised a brilliant scheme. He would have Roosevelt kicked upstairs to the one office that could neutralize him, the powerless and ceremonial vice presidency. McKinley's brilliant political manager and closest friend, Mark Hanna, was appalled. He saw the untamed, ambitious force of nature in Roosevelt and understood the profound risk. "Don't any of you realize," Hanna fumed, "that there's only one life between this madman and the presidency?" But the party bosses prevailed. Roosevelt, the hero of San Juan Hill, was added to the ticket. The combination was politically irresistible. McKinley, the calm, dignified statesman, and Roosevelt, the vibrant, youthful war hero, swept to a victory even more decisive than their triumph in 1896. It was a clear and powerful mandate for McKinley's vision of a prosperous, powerful America. William McKinley began his second term with a quiet but profound sense of evolving purpose. He had been the high priest of the protective tariff for his entire career, but now, as the leader of a global power, his worldview was expanding. In his second inaugural address, he spoke less of exclusion and more of connection. He began to champion the idea of reciprocity, of mutual trade agreements that would lower tariffs and foster a new era of global commerce and understanding. "The period of exclusiveness is past," he declared. The man who had built his career on protecting America's borders was now looking to open its doors to the world. In the summer of 1901, the perfect symbol of this new, confident, and technologically ascendant America was on display for the world to see. 2. The Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. It was a magnificent fairground, a testament to the wonders of the new century. Its grand pavilions and towers were bathed in the glow of thousands of electric lights, powered by the recently harnessed energy of nearby Niagara Falls. It was a city of light, a dreamscape of progress and boundless optimism. In September, President McKinley, the embodiment of this new era, traveled to Buffalo to deliver a major address. On September 5th, he stood before a vast crowd under a perfect blue sky. His speech was the culmination of his evolving vision, a call for peace and global cooperation. "Isolation is no longer possible or desirable," he stated, his voice calm and steady. "Our commercial rivals in the world are submitting to the irresistible law of friendly cooperation and trade reciprocity. We must not be idle." It was the speech of a statesman at the height of his powers, looking forward to a century of American prosperity and peace. The following day, September 6th, was destined for the public. After a morning trip to see the majestic Niagara Falls with his wife Ida, the president was scheduled to attend a public reception at the exposition's ornate Temple of Music. His personal secretary, George Cortelyou, was deeply troubled by the security arrangements. He had seen a disturbing number of anarchists and radicals in the Buffalo crowds, and twice begged the president to cancel the event. But McKinley, a man who genuinely believed in the affection of the American people, gently refused. "Why should I?" he asked. "No one would wish to hurt me." It was his duty, he felt, to be among the people he served. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, he stood inside the sweltering Temple of Music. A long line of citizens, shuffling forward to shake the hand of their president. He was, as always, gracious and kind. As a young girl approached, he smiled warmly, unpinned the red carnation he always wore on his lapel, his good luck charm, and gave it to her. Further back in that line, a slight 28-year-old man named Leon Czolgosz was inching his way forward. He was an unemployed factory worker, a social outcast who had drifted into the radical ideology of anarchism. He had been deeply affected by the recent assassination of King Umberto I of Italy by an anarchist, and he came to believe it was his duty to strike a blow against what he saw as an oppressive government. In his right hand, he held a .32 caliber Iver Johnson revolver, completely concealed by a handkerchief wrapped around it to make it appear as if his hand were bandaged. As Czolgosz reached the front of the line, President McKinley smiled and extended his left hand to greet the man's seemingly injured right. In that instant, Czolgosz shoved the president's hand aside, pressed the hidden revolver into McKinley's abdomen, and fired twice. For a split second, there was a stunned silence, followed by screams and chaos. McKinley staggered backward, a look of disbelief on his face. As Secret Service agents and soldiers tackled Czolgosz to the ground, beating him mercilessly, McKinley's first thought was not of himself. He gasped to his guards, his voice weak but clear, "Don't let them hurt him." Even as he was dying, his instinct was one of shocking clemency. As he was helped into a chair, his second thought flew to his beloved, fragile wife. He turned to his secretary, his voice barely a whisper. "My wife. Be careful, Cortelyou, how you tell her. Oh, be careful." It was the final heartbreaking testament to a lifetime of devotion. He was rushed to the Exposition Small Emergency Hospital. On an operating table lit by a single, bare electric bulb, doctors frantically worked to save him. They easily found and removed one bullet, but they could not locate the second. Fearing the shock of a longer operation and believing the president was in stable condition, the surgeons cleaned the wound and stitched it closed, leaving the second bullet inside. For several days, a wave of optimism swept the nation. The president was resting comfortably, his vital signs were strong, and it seemed the quiet man's famous luck would hold. But inside his body, a silent, deadly infection was spreading from the unrecovered bullet, which had torn through his stomach and pancreas. Without antibiotics, the doctors were helpless. Gangrene was setting in. A week after the shooting, his condition took a sudden, catastrophic turn for the worse. He faced the end with the same quiet dignity and profound faith that had defined his life. He knew he was dying. He gathered his sobbing wife and his cabinet members around his bed. He whispered the Lord's Prayer with them. As he held Ida's hand for the last time, he comforted her with the words of his favorite hymn, the credo of his life. "It is God's way, His will, not ours, be done." Early on the morning of September 14th, 1901, William McKinley died. The nation was plunged into a state of profound shock and deep, genuine grief. The quiet, decent, and universally respected man who had led them out of depression and onto the world stage was gone. And in that moment, the awesome power of the presidency passed to the one man the political bosses had tried to neutralize, the madman from New York. At the age of 42, Theodore Roosevelt was President of the United States. The quiet 19th century presidency was over. The loud, boisterous 20th century had just begun. William McKinley's legacy is one of quiet, pivotal consequence. He is the great, often overlooked bridge between two Americas. He was the last of the Civil War veterans to lead the country, a man of deep Victorian character whose life was defined by duty, faith, and a profound sense of personal honor. His presidency closed the chapter on an America focused inward, and his tragic, unwilling decisions and his even more tragic death threw open the door to the American century, an era of global power and boisterous energy that would be personified by his larger-than-life successor. He was a man of peace who led the nation to war and empire, a gentle, deliberate man whose death made way for an era of unstoppable, boisterous energy.